What I want to talk about really is the need for us to study up rather than study down. And I guess my talk comes under the disaster studies language of disaster risk reduction, although that's not the language I tend to use to frame it myself. Last night after the first day of the conference, I had some qualms about whether I might even delete my first slide. Would I be courageous enough to talk about it? Because I actually wanted to start by problematizing one of the key concepts that underpins the conference itself and the whole emergency services sector, and that's the concept of resilience. I was given a little bit of heart yesterday when Maureen said that her centre actually did critically engage with some of these concepts, rather taken for granted concepts, because I do think that resilience is a taken for granted concept, and I just want to really problematise it just a little bit. If I can get this to work.
Button on the right.
On the right. Yep. Great. Now, the concept of resilience actually comes out of natural systems theory. And in fact, the concept, it has involved a migration from the natural sciences to the social sciences. In the natural sciences, it's about the stability of a system to recover its shape after an interference. And this migration from the natural sciences to the social sciences is based on the presumption that the ecological systems, parallel the social and human dynamics of societies. So the argument is that we can take these concepts from the natural sciences and simply transplant them and apply them to human societies, and that these concepts have a resonance and a relevance. And I really want to raise some questions about that, because the concept of resilience also places onus on individuals and communities to become more resilient to a range of external threats. Now, the problem I have with resilience is that it's often disconnected from any kind of critical social theorising about power, about interest, about patriarchy, about capitalism, about neoliberalism. It's often disconnected from these broader political concepts. And I think it's potentially quite a conservative concept. Potentially quite conservative, because its focus is on how people adapt, how people and communities adapt to disasters and climate change and global warming, rather than interrogate the causes of those climate-related disasters. And so I think it can often lead to a process whereby people and communities accommodate to existing inequalities in society rather than transform and change them. And it fits very comfortably with neoliberalism, with its focus on individual and community responsibility. Now, there is some people who utilise the concept are mindful of some of these criticisms. And so there is a question about whether the concept is redeemable or not. Some people say, well, look, we can talk about critical forms of resilience or situated resilience. Some people say, well, look, maybe we should talk about resourcefulness rather than resilience. Some people say, well, look, maybe it's more to do with the political purposes to which the concept is being put. So who's using resilience? What are their purposes? How are they using it in a particular way? But I actually think that resilience is, unless we contextualise it, is actually a dangerous concept. I believe it's a dangerous concept because I think that it doesn't really address the broader issues of structural inequality in society. Now, I guess the issue is that I'd really want to open up some discussion and debate about whether or not we continue to use this concept or not. And what I want to do is I want to move from the concept of resilience to that of privilege. Now, just a quote from Alison Bailey from key article in 1998, where she defines privilege as systematically conferred advantages that individuals enjoy by virtue of their membership of dominant groups with access to resources and institutional power that are beyond the common advantages of marginalised citizens. So privilege is the flip side of marginalisation, of disadvantage, of oppression. For every group that is oppressed or marginalised or discriminated against, there is ipso facto a group that is privileged in relation to that group. And the privilege is not earned. It comes about just by virtue of your membership of that group. And so in 2010 I published a book on this concept of privilege, where I looked at 6 intersecting sites of privilege to do with political economy and class elitism, gender order, white supremacy, institutionalised heterosexuality, Western dominance, and also ableist relations and the embodiment of privilege. And I was looking at how we might begin to think about undoing privilege from within, how those of us who are members of those groups might develop what I call a privilege cognizance, and how we might start to interrogate and transform that from within. And just to give you some of the dimensions of it, I mean, some of the ways that privilege works is that those that have it tend to not think of themselves as having it. It tends to be invisible to those that have it. It's not invisible to those that don't. But if you've got privilege, people often are not reflective about it or aware of it. It tends to be referred to normativity. Privileged groups become the model for normal human relations. And in some ways this is a problem I have with the notion of inclusiveness and inclusion, because very often we're endeavouring to bring those that are excluded and marginalised into a normative, inclusive frame that doesn't really do justice to where others are coming from. And I think, we have to be, I would want to problematise the concept of inclusion and inclusiveness as well for those reasons. There's a naturalness about privilege. People believe that it's somehow inherited from nature rather than seeing the ways in which it's socially constructed. And there's a deep sense of entitlement that goes with it. People who are privileged believe that they deserve respect in relation to an acknowledgement and that they need to be rewarded accordingly for having that privilege. So these are some of the dynamics that operate in relation to privilege. And I think that with privilege comes responsibility. And I want to talk here about a concept that Joan Tronto developed called privileged irresponsibility. And this is where those in privileged groups actually fail to acknowledge their exercise of power. Those who receive benefits from others are dependent on others to be able to live well in the world. And yet privileged groups absent themselves from responsibility. Now, Tronto used this in relation to the way that men absent themselves from caring responsibilities, that men get a pass out from having to be involved in care. I want to apply her concept to the notion of global warming, because I think that global warming is one of the most significant manifestations of privilege to face humankind. The global north is comprised of 20% of the world's population, and yet utilises 80% of the world's resources. And so developed countries, it seems to me, owe a climate debt to developing countries because of our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And it seems to me that, it's clearly we know that it's rich countries, rich, affluent, industrialised countries of the world that are creating the major problems, and those on the receiving end are the poorer, marginalised people. And yet, when we see with the Paris Climate Agreement, the industrialised, once you start to go and look at what commitments that have been made by countries in the global north to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that the industrialised, privileged countries are in no way contributing to their equitable and fair share of reductions. There is a dramatic disparity between the contributions that have been made through the Paris Climate Agreement and the responsibility of those in the privileged north to acknowledge the contribution they're making to global warming. Now, one of the things we sometimes talk about is the way in which global warming and climate change and disasters actually generate forms of violence. But what we don't talk enough about, I think, is to actually think about how global warming and climate-related disasters are themselves a form of violence. We can talk about global warming as a form of structural violence. And John Galtung some years ago defined structural violence as legitimised violence exercised by corporations and the state to reproduce social institutions. And I think that violence against the environment is a form of structural violence because it's the social forces contributing to disasters that are largely ignored. Rob Nixon published a book a few years ago titled Slow Violence, Environmentalism of the Poor, where he looks at the nature of the slowness and the incremental ways in which global warming and climate change are actually creating havoc across the world, particularly in countries of the global south, and impacting on not only the environment, but the people who inhabit those environments. So environmental violence, it seems to me, by governments and corporations is a crime. If it's not a crime, it ought to be a crime. We actually need to start to criminalise the environmental violence that is caused by corporations and the state. And we also need to remember that this environmental violence is classed, it's gendered, and it's raced. In the sense that the majority of those that inhabit the corporations and the state that are causing the violence are upper class white men.
10 minutes, Bob.
10 minutes, thank you. It's conservative white males in the global north who represent, it seems to me, the epitome of privilege. White men in government and corporations are the main drivers of environmental violence, this is sometimes referred to as the conservative white male effect. So this is the other kind of diversity. We often talk about diversity in terms of the marginalisation of people with multiple forms of disadvantage. But what about multiple forms of privilege? And I think this is something we need to look at. There are differences between men's and women's ecological footprints as well in industrialised countries, but I won't go into that now because I'm running out of time very, very quickly. I want to talk briefly about the links between climate change denial and hegemonic masculinity, because those that organise the lobby groups in terms of climate change denial are again conservative white men, and that there's a relationship between dominant forms of masculinity then and a tendency to deny the reality of climate change and global warming. There's a concern by class privileged white men of protecting a particular form of capitalist, neoliberal and white supremacist society rather than actually preserving the planet. And so we have a situation here that those that contribute most to global warming and climate change are the least likely to do anything about it. It's white, class privileged men, in part because they experience a form of environmental privilege. Their white, class privileged men are least likely to be affected in the short term by the kind of massive changes to the environment. And this constitutes another form of privilege, what I call environmental privilege. Now here's a picture of diversity for you. This is a photo taken at the climate change conference in Paris. And so it's not only that white class privileged men are causing global warming, it's white class privileged men that are responsible, dominate the organisations for addressing it. And that then takes a shape in the way in which it's addressed. Climate change is framed as a technical problem rather than a social and political problem. There's a masculinist mindset embedded in the whole notion of the environmental management, managing the environment. We see geoengineering attempts to fix the skies that somehow technology will save us. So hegemonic masculinity is deeply involved in how we address climate change. It's also involved even in green politics. You know, some people feel that to be green is to be unmasculine in some way. And some of the ways that the environment movement tries to get more men involved is to make green politics more masculinist, which is the last thing we need to be doing. So, what is to be done? 4 quick provocations. 1, I think we have to link so-called natural disasters to social, economic and cultural relations. We need to bring critical environmental science much more explicitly into our understanding of disaster risk reduction than it is currently the case now. I also want to suggest, and this is perhaps where there's another provocation, I want to see a shift from the focus on vulnerability to disasters and climate change to the role that privileged groups play in perpetuating and reproducing and causing disasters. I want to see that shift in focus. And I think for me this means we need to change our dominator relationship in relation to nature. We have to rethink the way in which we as men relate to nature. And I think we also need to embrace what I call a critical ethic of care for the planet as well as caring for other human beings. So I'm going to stop there.